Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Day of Dialogue panel featuring five wonderful authors who will refresh our perspectives through their personal narratives of exploring self, family, and community. My name is Michael Rodriguez. I'm a senior strategist with the Lyrasis Library Consortium, and I'm your moderator for this panel. And now, let's welcome our authors. First, we have Hala Alyan, author of I'll Tell You When I'm Home, published by Avid Reader Press, a division of Simon & Schuster. I'll add here that Hala was not able to join us for today's panel live, so we'll be showing a pre-recorded video of her remarks instead later in the panel. We do have four other authors joining us live. We'll start with Aymann Ismail, author of Becoming Baba, Fatherhood, Faith, and Finding Meaning in America, published by Doubleday. Next up, we have Joseph Lee, author of Nothing More of This Land, Community, Power, and the Search for Indigenous Identity, published by Atria and One Signal Publishers, which is part of Simon & Schuster. We also have Erika J. Simpson, author of This Is Your Mother, published by Scribner. And finally, Nicholas Triolo, author of The Way Around, a field guide to going nowhere, published by Milkweed Editions. Folks, thank you for being here. Let's begin with each of you giving us all an overview of your books and of what you think readers can hope to glean from your stories. And more specifically, how do your relationships with your parents and with parenthood and with ancestors lie at the heart of your stories? We'll start with Aymann and continue with Joseph, Erika, and then Nick.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. So my name is Aymann Ismail. I'm a journalist with Slate Magazine. Arab American, born and raised in America, but it often feels like I wasn't born here. It feels like I've grown up in like this in-between space between where I recognize as home and where it feels like my parents want me to relate to someplace else. So being Egyptian American is really all about having like very strong national ideals, very strong histories, very strong cultural ties to a place you've never been. And it could feel like that, right? Especially when it comes to being Arab American in this country where so many people have so many strong feelings about who you are before they even get to know you. And that's the world where I grew up. And Becoming Baba is a meditation on that. It's a reflection on what it means uh, to not only explain yourself to people about who you are, but also how to do that at a time when you don't necessarily know the answers yourself. And then what happens when when your life changes forever, when you become a parent, and then you have kids, and now you're worried about how they're going to be interacting with their own identities, and whether or not I myself is I'm going to be, and I'm going to feel like the weakest link in failing to translate all of this history and all of this cultural heritage into my Egyptian children. And so Becoming Baba asks the question, what happens when you are not sure of who you are, but now you feel like you need to be sure because you're a parent now and you have the responsibility to teach your kids how to be and how to exist in their own bodies. But it's not a book just about parenting. It's not a book about migration or even masculinity for that matter, even though it's a book about fatherhood. But it's about coming to terms with the fact that you are going to be answering questions that you won't have the answer for and learning to live with yourself and be generous with yourself when it comes to doing your best.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and so happy to be here, and especially with this group of amazing fellow authors. I'm very excited to read everybody's books. So I'm a Wampanoag, which is a small tribe. We're from Martha's Vineyard, and we're known for two things. One is that the Wampanoag people are the ones who greeted the Pilgrims when they came off the Mayflower about 400 years ago. And, we shared sort of the mythical American first Thanksgiving meal with those folks. And the other thing we're known for is being on Martha's Vineyard, which is, this very sort of exclusive elite American vacation spot. Presidents go there, movie stars go there. And, so I grew up in the tribe with the context of these two things, but not understanding a lot else about our history, even though, I grew up in the tribe and I was going to tribal events and in the community. And the book really comes from a place of me trying to understand that history and trying to understand what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be Indigenous from a place like Martha's Vineyard, and maybe even more particularly Indigenous from the East Coast of this country, which I think is talked about a little bit less. So the book really came from me trying to understand and explore those themes. And then as a journalist, those questions that I was asking about land and community and identity took me across the country and around the world to meet Indigenous folks and communities, from Alaska, Oklahoma, Ecuador, all these other places. And so sort of the book transitions from my personal story and personal questions to these much bigger questions around the world of, what it means to be Indigenous and how can we tackle these shared challenges. And so in that way, I think the book was always going to be a book about legacy and ancestry and where we come from. But it's also, about uncovering this sort of lost history that, history is not taught in schools. It's often not talked about. It's ignored. And so it's really a goal of mine to um, do something that was kind of challenging that sort of common perspective and put something out there that, had a different perspective. And, part of that is just trying to honor all the people who came before me and share their stories as much as possible and create this sort of alternative narrative. And yeah, thanks.
Hello, thanks for having me. So I am Erika. My memoir, This Is Your Mother, is largely about my mom who had cancer 4 times. And before the fifth time took her, when I was born, she had a brain tumor and they told her not to have me. But she was very resilient and she was a June Gemini, which is very important. June Geminis are some very particular people: Kanye, Kendrick Lamar, Trump. They're very particular people who are interested in their dreams. And she's a big dreamer. And so for me, we grew up very poor because although she was very educated, we're also Black in America. And she was divorced and in a new city. And so we were often like living in hotels and things and getting evicted while she had that cancer. And so my memoir is a dual timeline of the last 6 months of my mother's life, as well as following me as a 9-year-old, learning about all of this stuff and trying to learn how to survive from my mother, who is very Christian, very much about God. And because she was always so sick and so poor, I couldn't really be that much of a Christian in the way she could, but I did see her as godlike because she always made a way out of no way. And so when she passed, I had the question of like, who am I now? Because she was such a storyteller and everything was about her struggles. And so it's just interesting to be a daughter without a mother. So my older sister has a child now who's 4, my sweet niece. And so she gets to see life from that perspective of motherhood, but I'm still a daughter. And so my memoir is largely about our parents being multifaceted people and like not trying to assert blame of like who's responsible, why were we poor, why did you make those decisions, but just seeing your parents as three-dimensional people in the same way that we are. Like half the time they're just kids when they had us and they still want like have goals and ambitions. And so that's what my memoir is about: learning who I am in my own story because of her, in spite of her, um, everything. You know what I mean? Like I am because of her. So that's what my memoir is about, just sort of trying to honor our mothers, honor our mothers, even if they made mistakes.
Wow, this is an incredible group of writers, and really grateful to be here. My book is called The Way Around, A Field Guide to Going Nowhere, and it is written for my mother, Erika. So thanks for teeing that one up. I grew up in a family of high-performing athletes and grew up with a sort of cultural script to sort of do more, go faster, go higher, harder, as we all have, or as in the Western world. And I'm also, in addition to being a writer, a long-distance mountain runner. So grew up in a sort of mountain running culture, a mountain culture, and was really started writing this book as a counter narrative to a lot of the sort of king of the mountain conquest vernacular that I found in the mountain in recreation culture. and was sort of frustrated by that language and wanted some sort of counter narrative, some sort of counter force. And what I found was when I started learning about these people who would walk around mountains, they would circumambulate mountains at the base, and they would intentionally leave the summit alone. A sort of kinesthetic form of restraint that was found. It's found in major religious traditions on every habitable continent. And I spent the last basically 15 years tracking stories of people who stay off the mountains, stay off the summit of the mountain anyway, as a form of restraint and as a form of kinesthetic reverence and restraint to land. I think it's a meditation on how the shapes we follow, the shapes that are sort of that are underneath our stories, our myths that we follow in our life, culturally and personally and familially, how those shapes shape us, that shape our lives. And I make the case in my memoir that the shape that we're following as a culture, as a modern culture, is quite suicidal. It's quite linear. And so the book is a deeply personal meditation on trying to adopt, trying to walk into a new shape. I travel from the western lip of Tibet through to Northern California, end up in Montana, where I live currently, where I circumambulate the largest Superfund site in the country, the most toxic site in the country. I basically walk, I do sort of a pilgrimage to the Anthropocene at the end of this book. And my mother, just to speak to your question about parenthood, my mother is a big part of this book. I grapple in part two with some of her, she comes down with breast cancer. So there's a whole kind of thread of coming closer to my mother and her health concerns, and also her as a sort of a recovering professional athlete. She played Wimbledon. She was a professional tennis player. And so grappling with this sort of, are you enough, this enoughness, this cultural enoughness as conduited through moving through landscapes.
It's amazing. Thank you, folks. And I think spotting a common thread here, I think all of your memoirs and narratives grapple with parenthood and being a son and being a daughter and also about the concepts of personal identity and formulating those in a really complex reality. So Joseph, I want to go back to a point you made in your book, that when you wrote that you felt you had to pick being either Wampanoag or Chinese or Japanese, but that now you choose to pick them all. And I'd love us to dig deeper into that concept of multifaceted identity. What has it meant to you to be Indigenous and?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Nick, I'm glad you brought up this sort of thing about we're always expected to be enough and always feeling inadequate, because I think it very much comes from that place. And I think people can relate to this, whether you're indigenous or not, that it's very easy to feel not enough, whether that's at work, in school, family, your identity, whatever it is. And I think indigenous identity has this kind of somewhat unique characteristic that if you're not 100%, you're not enough, right? There's this expectation of purity, of completeness, that you have to be like all in with being indigenous, or maybe you're not really. And I think I didn't realize until, you know, later in life that I had sort of like embodied this cultural stereotype of what it meant to be indigenous. And so I thought that it had to look a certain way. I had to speak the language. I had to think a certain way. I had to be a certain way. I had to live in a certain way. And, eventually I realized that I had spent all this time thinking about what indigenous identity was supposed to be, or what other people were telling me it was, that I hadn't spent really any time thinking about what I thought it was, or what I wanted it to be, or the ways that I could shape it, and I could shape my own relationship with identity and my community and my family. And so that bit, Michael, that you highlighted really comes from that place of, I always thought like, well, I have to do this one thing and I'm going to be this way. But then I realized that, who I am is all of those things. And there are going to be parts in my life where maybe one thing is a little bit closer to the surface, but that doesn't mean that the other things aren't there, or that it has to be that way forever. And so I think it has really come to be this thing where I'm really kind of embracing the evolution of that, and that it doesn't have to be this static thing, right? Probably everybody here could relate to that it's like, this is an ever-changing thing. And I'm sure, in 5 years, I'll feel differently. In 10 years, I'll feel differently. And I hope I do.
Thank you, Joseph. And I think the journey of identity that you talk about in your book, I think probably resonates with you, Ayman, and your journey as a Muslim and an Egyptian American, an Arab American, and the ways your memoirs, I think, addressed sort of the sometimes unsettled union of these diverse elements of identity. So how has this in-betweenness, which I think you alluded to earlier, how has that played out for you in your memoir and in your life?
Yeah, it's funny. Everything that everyone said so far, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how it feels. Uh, it's amazing how universal these feelings are. But for me, when it comes to like writing my book, when I started, I had just had kids. Like my kids were fresh. I was writing half of it while feeding a kid a bottle or being interrupted mid-sentence to run and go change a diaper. So I was in it. And writing the book was a real helpful way of sitting with these feelings and processing them in real time. And especially when it comes to existing in like an in-between space, when you're a new parent, there's no time for that. You can't sit around and reflect on like how outside people might be thinking about you or perceiving you. You're just there with the baby, right? And that in a way was like very freeing, because then I started to see the joy and the opportunity with being in this in between space. Particularly as like a Muslim American and an Egyptian American, there is so much tradition involved. There's so many practices, even in like the way you're supposed to pick up your baby for the first time. There's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it, surprisingly. And in the book, I find out what it's like to study it and do it and do it in the best way that I can, and still have somebody who's like your senior come in and be like, well, you kind of did this wrong, you kind of did that wrong. And when you're a new parent, that all kind of feels so small compared to the moment that you're in. And this book is mostly about what it's like to go through the trial of trying to sort all of these things, trying to figure out what part of you relates to what identity you relate to, and it also parses through all the expectations you might have to perform your identity in a way. But when it comes to parenting, or at least the way it was for me, you need to let all that go. You need to put all that in the past. You're supposed to become a new person. The way that I frame it in the book is that you need time to mourn the version of yourself that had just died so that you can make space for the new version of yourself. And in that sense, I've really, in this book in particular, I've really learned to find the joy and being in this in-between space, and how in a lot of cases it could be more rewarding. And one more thing that's in the book is like there's this moment where I'm going against what I'm supposed to be doing, but then it feels more true. And that to me, I feel like is the principal thrust of what becoming Bubba is, and what I think readers could benefit from. It's about knowing the right thing, trying to figure out how to do it, and then realizing and discovering, kind of like Joseph, that there's another way to do it entirely. And that moment of discovery is so joyous. It's incredible.
Incredible. Thank you, Eamon. And Eric, I saw you nodding vigorously during your co-panelist answers. So, what would you like to contribute to the conversation around identity and sort of this in-betweenness and multifacetedness?
Everyone's so multicultural up in here. Like Eamon was saying about being like, or Joseph too. I feel like everyone's talking about it just of being so many things and what's expected of you. Oh, Eamon said, you're born here, but but it's like I feel like I'm not even born here. That's like literally what it's like to be Black American as well. Everyone telling you like go back to your country. It was like where here, the one I built. You know what I mean? Like you still don't feel like you're enough for it, as Nick and Joseph were saying. So sometimes even for my identity, I don't really have a history, a family tree, because that was stolen from us. So above my grandma, I don't know. I don't know like who's up there. And so all I have, like, that's why my mother was so heavy into like education and stuff, because it's like that's so important to like invest in yourself. Um, as Emma was just saying about like who I am and that stuff, like my perception, how I'm being perceived doesn't matter in my own home. Like I am who I am, and I have to develop myself as a person to just be authentic. Sometimes in America, the struggle is just to be authentic. You know what I mean? I don't want to ramble too long. I'll lose my train of thought. But yeah, I'm just agreeing with everyone about being enough.
Great. Thanks, Erika. um, Nick, I want to shift a little bit away from the notions of identity and go to a great phrase that you use a lot in your book called circumambulations, which is just rolls off the tongue, and I want to hear more about it. So you talked about these sort of pilgrimages, these long walks that took you to three very different places in the world. So what first drew you to this notion of the circular journey and what significance does it hold for you and perhaps for everyone?
Yeah, maybe I'll just connect real quick back to what something Amos said, and hopefully I get it right. You said something about something had to die, an identity in you to have something else be born. I think that the beginning of my book, to get to your question, is it starts, and this might sound a little disconnected, but it's totally connected. It starts with this 100-mile foot race, 100-mile foot race that goes to the mountains in Northern California called the Western States 100-mile endurance run, and it's you basically run in a straight line for 100 miles in one day. And the book starts at the end of this race that I run, and I use the exact same words that you said. I sort of something died at the end of this race so that something else could be born. And what was born at the end of this race was something like what opened my heart and my curiosity towards other ways of being in the world that wasn't pile driving your body to the ground, basically, like with just the cultural script of more, faster, better, harder. And I hit a wall. I hit a proverbial wall that linearity of thought wasn't productive or wasn't helpful. And as a culture and as a species, it was destructive in so many levels. So what really like kind of tenderized me to circumambulation, the world's most difficult word. Tibetans call it kora, which is much more aesthetically beautiful. Was this? I mean, originally I was actually drawn to it in Kathmandu in Nepal. I was exposed to Kora in Bodhana, which is a sort of a site of Tibetan refugee in that area and communities. And it was essentially something about it brought me into right relationship, into right cadence. You know, someone said something, a phrase recently, the moving at the pace of trust. And something about pace is a cadence, moving at the cadence of trust, moving at the cadence of something that is the cadence of curiosity, the cadence of honoring the fact that a circuitous motion around a place or a self or a loved one is to actually honor all the different parts and sides of a self. And so, in fact, the shape itself isn't just a literal pilgrimage so much as it is an honoring of the inclusivity and the totality of an honoring of the self and of another place, of another culture, of another species, another species, another landscape. So it actually was a beautiful counter shape to something that I actually like sort of died to in the beginning. In the first like 14 pages of this book, you travel places, you go places in the preface, and it starts with the death, a psychospiritual death that opens the heart up to a place that's more circuitous, more ecological, seasonal, and it's sort of revolutionary. I mean, etymologically, it's revolving. It's a revolutionary shape, this circumambulation. So, not sure if I answered that question. Kind of rambled, kind of blacked out, but there we go.
As long as I get to say the word circumambulation repeatedly, I'm happy, Nick. Thank you. That was a great answer and a great word. Um, Erika, I wanted to explore a couple other themes in your book. So in a few of your chapters, you use a fictionalized version of what turned out to be a real-life television show hosted by Jonathan Frakes and called Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction. And for me, it felt like you used the show to explore faith and fate and truth. And I'm just curious if you can talk about how these themes play out in your relationship with your mom.
Yeah. Any Beyond Belief fans, fact or fiction? I feel like I'm starting to get old. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Well, it's a show where there's 5 stories told to you, hosted by Jonathan Frakes of Star Trek fame. And you have to guess, it's just like ghost stories, and then you guess which ones are true or not. So, like I said, my mother was all about faith, and I only had faith in her. And she taught me to have faith in myself. Okay. So while she was sick, when I was a child, I was like, I need to become famous. I need to get to Hollywood. That is the only way I will heal my family, is by making like That's So Raven money, Kiki Palmer money. You know what I mean? I wanted to be famous. So my mother had me dreaming just as big as she. But the point is about faith. Sometimes, even when we're talking about identities and truth, sometimes two things can be true at once, right? I can be Japanese and Chinese. You know what I mean? Like, I can be indigenous and I can be American. You know what I'm saying? Like, I can be all of these things and it can all exist together. So when it comes to miracles, right? Like, what creates a miracle? My mother was big to me because they kept telling that woman she was gonna die. They would be like, "You're gonna be dead in a year, baby," and she would be like, "Not my God, okay, not me." And she would live another 2 years, and then they would be like, "You're gonna die in 5 years," and she'd be like, "Mm-hmm," and she would live another 6. So I believe, like, she felt like she felt magical to me. And so I wanted to explore her stories, because she also, when you're heavily impoverished, it does actually damage your brain. So she did develop bipolar disorder, just because you start feeling like people are playing games with me. So I miss her so much, because now I'm gonna call her and be like, "They playing games, mama. They holding my check." You know what I mean? Like, so I wanted to explore like seeing experiences, because we all go through experiences and we all have our own perspective. So what I might say, like, God was incredible, you might say maybe the nurses were incredible, and maybe both of those things were true. Maybe a miracle did save you. Maybe the miracle is that good doctors are in the building, you know? So I just wanted to show, like, even if someone is mentally ill, right? It's like a broken clock is right 2 times a day. You know what I mean? Like, just because you're mentally ill doesn't mean that you're wrong. You just are sick. So that I'm just exploring a lot of stuff, and even questioning faith. Because I'd never want to go into a book being like, God isn't real or something like that. But I just want to ask questions about, like, can we expect God to save us? How do we save ourselves? Things like that. How do you have faith when it feels like there's nothing to believe in? And Nick keeps talking about shapes and change. And it just reminds me of Octavia Butler, who in Parable of the Sower, which you have to read this year if you haven't read it. It's almost a hard read now, because she predicts so much. Oh God. But she says God is change. And I think I feel like that's what my book is about. Like, maybe God is you, God is me, God is my mother. God is just doing something different for a different result. God is shaping. You know what I mean? God is shaping. So yeah, I'll start crying.
It's amazing, Erica. Thank you. And Parable of the Sower is a fantastic. Octavia Butler is just such a great writer. Um, so now let's hear from our fifth author, Hala Alyan. She wasn't able to join us live for today's panel, but we'll go ahead and play a short pre-recorded video of her discussing her book with us. And I'll just pause for a couple moments while the video starts.
Hi, my name is Hala Alyan. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with everybody today, and really honored to be sharing space, even virtually, with all these amazing writers. I just wanted to talk a little bit and introduce my book. So my forthcoming memoir is called I'll Tell You When I'm Home. It's being published by Avid Reader Press through Simon and Schuster. It comes out on June 3rd. And just to touch on some of the themes, it's basically, this is the first long form nonfiction prose project I've undertaken, and it was one of the more, perhaps the most, meaningful, poignant kind of project I've thrown myself in. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the format and the structure and the content was being excavated and kind of formed as I was writing the story, because a lot of the content and a lot of the things that were happening in the book had either just happened or were sort of happening, and I was having to kind of do these like real time updates. So the book, in terms of summary, is kind of like a chronicling of a sense of, a desire for motherhood, seeking motherhood through surrogacy, really kind of back in COVID days, I kind of began undertaking my uh, pursuit of parenthood, only to find out that I actually had a lot of fertility issues, and in the following year and a half had a series of miscarriages, did IUIs, did IVF, etc. And just kind of kept trying and trying and trying and trying, and that word really in all these different ways. While the world sort of felt like it had kind of come to a standstill during the pandemic, and there was such a sense of, I think in the book I play with this idea of like exile, as the child of immigrants. I'm Palestinian, uh, on my mom's side, Syrian and Lebanese. My father was born in Gaza, and really kind of like growing up in these households, watching my elders, my parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, really like to traverse exile kind of in this very intense firsthand way, and then figuring out where I was placed and how to locate myself within that. I'm somebody that was born in the States and then lived in the Middle East, specifically Kuwait, until I was 4. And then during Saddam's invasion, came back to the States until I was a teenager, then went back to the Arab world, did high school and college in Lebanon, and then came back for grad school. And so I've had this interesting experience of sort of like traversing between those two worlds back and forth in different eras of my life. And when I was preparing for motherhood in all these different ways, so both literally within my body, and then when I sort of realized that it wasn't going to happen that way, and we found this incredible surrogate who carried our embryo, later became my daughter. Um, and so my daughter's biologically ours, but spent those first, months of her life inside somebody else and being carried by somebody else, being birthed by somebody else. And during that time, I really didn't know what my role was. And so I started kind of returning to these different archetypes across literature and across mythology of like the women that wait, and in particular, what it means to wait for something. And one of the tent poles of the book, in many ways, is Shahrazad's A Thousand and One Nights, and sort of the role of like the speaker and the storyteller. Um, and so I think that's been one of the things I'm really excited about in seeing how the book is received, and how, what readers kind of take away from it is the intersection of like exile and storytelling and motherhood, and what it means to, yeah, what it means to want something, and what it means to have to tell stories to survive, which I think we're all essentially doing some version of that. Um, so yeah, I hope you read it. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hala. Hala Alyan is, she touched on this, is she's a licensed clinical psychologist as well as a poet and writer. And this makes me think of how we choose our careers and how careers shape us in turn. So I want to go to you, Aymann. You're a multimedia journalist. I've watched your videos for Slate. How has your work and your vocation shaped how you see the world and yourself? And in particular, how has photography influenced your approach to writing?
That's so cool. Thank you for checking that stuff out, and I can't wait to read Hala's book. Just got, so I'm excited. Um, that's an interesting question. So I think of this book as like a continuation of my journalism. It's a memoir. I'm looking back at my own life, and so in a lot of my journalism, I try and reflect on my own lived experience as a way to look for story opportunities, as a way to relate subjects, and trying to extract the truth from them. So a lot of what I do is I ask difficult questions that feel like they don't really have an answer, to try and get to a closer version of the truth that I think will be beneficial and helpful to readers. That's sort of what I've always done. That's what I did one of the video series where I ask questions about what is the lived experience of Muslims and how does that relate to what people are saying about Muslims in media. And it's the same thing when I did the podcast where I was asking the same question about masculinity. Like, where do these myths about where men feel like they have to be a certain kind of men, where do those myths come from? And so for this book, it's like, what happens to your soul and your body when you transition out of just being a person and into becoming a parent, right? So that's the principle that I was trying to answer. And what was interesting about this book is that I started with my own parents. Um, I asked them, I was like, so how did you feel about all that you've done now looking back at your kids? They're all grown. They all graduated college. They all have careers. Like, how do you feel you've done? And this is like the very beginning of the book. It's just part of the introduction. And my mom tells me that she failed. She goes into all of the reasons as to why she feels like she let us down and like let God down, and she felt like if she could go back, she would change everything about the kind of mother that she was. And it was kind of disorienting for me because I just become a father, and I was sort of asking for her for like, how did you do what you did? Uh, and for me, like that to me sets the stage for the entirety of the rest of the book. It sets the stage for how we think of success when it comes to parenting, how we think of success when it comes to being as being a Muslim, how we think of success when it comes to being an Arab in America. These are all things that don't really have answers, and it's really easy to think of yourself as to hold yourself to this impossible standard where you're eventually going to hate yourself for all of the stuff that you did. And so the reason why I started here is because I wanted it to be clear for the reader that this is an exploration of what it's like to try and overcome your own internal trauma. It's an exploration for trying to overcome your own personal hangups for how you expect yourself to be better than you are. It's about insecurity. It's about being vulnerability. It's about having expectations for yourself and expectations for others, even. And so this is the same thing I do in my journalism, right? So one of my favorite pieces that I've ever done, it was right after it was in Minneapolis. It was after George Floyd was mercilessly killed by police officers there, and so I went maybe like 2 weeks after I felt like all the cameras had left. I waited for the news story to die. I waited for everybody to start talking about something else, and then I showed up. And then I started talking to people on the ground, and there was like this big memorial right in the center of the intersection, and there was the store right in front of where it happened. And my piece just explores uh, what now? Like, what happens now that all this has happened? This area is forever transformed. The people there have all forever been transformed. What happens now? And I'm trying now with this memoir to do the same thing for me. I had a baby, and then, over the course of the book, I had a second baby. What happens now? Who am I now? How am I going to feel about it when my kids are old and I'm looking back at my life and with the job that I did as a parent? What can I do to keep myself from feeling that way? And so it's all the same thing for me. Doing journalism is about looking for a truth through people who were witnesses. And this is the same thing here, except the witnesses in this case are me, my wife, my parents, my friends, everybody who's involved in my life. These are the witnesses that I'm trying to extract the greater truth from.
Fantastic. Thanks, Aymann. And your comment about Minneapolis as sort of a human and an urban landscape of tragedy, I think that reminds me of words from Nick when he talks about when Nick, you talk about your circumambulations in Tibet, California, and Montana, and sort of the human tragedies that have played out in those natural landscapes and the human stories and histories. So so how do those human histories of a place of a natural landscape affect how you experienced it?
Oh, they're so central. I was trained as a writer to really focus on portraits, people. I mean, I'm sort of an environmental writer by trade, but humans are so central to how we transmit that relationship with the more than human world. And I take like great pride and seriousness and truth, integrity, and depicting these people. There's like a sort of a central character in all three of these parts that really helps me explore the parts of these landscapes through the eyes and hearts and grief, frankly. And not only these characters, but also the locals. I mean, in the Tibet piece, the Tibet chapter part, I have a full like reckoning with like white dude goes to Tibet to like seek God. Like I interrogate that fully. And it's complicated. It was like spiritual tourism. And I mean, the group I went with was like, is a strange group. And that was part of the process. That was part of the mirror that this place like shoved in my face. And similarly, around Mount Tamalpais in San Francisco, there was a sort of like interesting, quirky group of people who would like tend to this walk, this pilgrimage. and they were a certain subset of the population, and my judgments all flared up, and yet through the thickets of that judgment came a larger circumference of compassion, which is actually the true shape that you see on the cover of this book is a circumference of compassion. Actually, I know that sounds a little like, I don't know, up in the clouds, but it's a fierce shape of compassion that in all three of these parts, there's a character that actually helps me dilate that emotional necessity in this time that we're in right now. For me, I needed that. I needed that first and foremost, to find a radical, dilated circumference of compassion for others, for other landscapes, other species, other people, and for myself, quite frankly. So yeah, people are absolutely central characters in this book, just as much as the landscape. And in fact, I blur both of those in an attempt to not like reinforce that binary that people aren't part of nature. But in fact, we are nature.
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, let's dig a bit deeper into that theme of land and people and those connections. So Joseph, in your book, you wrestle a lot with um, the land being core to native identities in many ways, yet many indigenous people no longer necessarily live on their ancestral lands. So can you tell us a bit about native concepts of land and homeland and how you've explored those in your book?
Yeah, I mean, the questions I was asking about land come from just the simple fact that the majority of my tribe does not live on our homelands. We don't live in the town where our tribe is right now, and still, most of us don't even live on Martha's Vineyard. Many of us don't live in the state. I'm from Massachusetts, but I live in New York now. And so I kind of wondered, what does it mean to be native when you're kind of all spread out, when sort of that stereotypical vision of what it means to be native that I was talking about before is like everybody lives, on the homelands, everybody's there together in the community. And, um, I think that presents challenges, but it's also this opportunity to grow and kind of be this bigger, more diverse community that's, out experiencing the world. And in the book, I write about, I think a couple of people have mentioned the pandemic, and I write about during the pandemic, we couldn't go home, we couldn't do meetings in person. And so for the first time ever, my tribe had an online language class on Zoom. I was like reconnecting with cousins. And so that actually, became sort of this moment where I realized like, oh, I don't have to restrict native identity and native things in my life to when I'm home on the land, right? The land is a big part of who we are, but it's not the only thing. And there are all these other ways to exist outside of it. Um, and then the other sort of unique thing about my community is that being on Martha's Vineyard, all these questions about native land and, the theft of native land and the exploitation of indigenous land are kind of heightened just because of what Martha's Vineyard is. It's this island, so it's small, and real estate prices are out of control. There are these giant houses, private beaches, all of these things. And, there's this kind of moment in the book where I'm doing a little research just to look up real estate prices. And I'm finding, like $8 million house, $10 million house, $30 million house. And there's one, I find one, I'm like really excited because it's less than a million. And I found out that it's not a house, it's just like an empty piece of land. And it's still like $950,000 for just like a piece of land. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's a question of, what is the value of land and what do we want to do with land? And just the last thing I'll say is that I also have questions about, what does it mean to have collective land versus family land versus personal land? And so, the way we build relationships with land is, I think, very personal. And so it's hard to think of these abstract ideas of like indigenous land or, the land of your country or your home, when the way you think about it is maybe like your grandfather or your mother. And so it's really trying to unpack some of those things.
Thanks, Joseph. And yeah, let's continue with the concept of home, not necessarily in relation to land. So, Erica, in your book, you quote your mom saying that home isn't a place, it's wherever you're surviving together. So, can you tell us a bit more about what home means to you and what it meant to you?
Yeah, so because there was so many evictions, I don't have a childhood home like the longest I've ever lived in a place was an apartment I had in my 20s that was really raggedy. It was only $600. So for me, home is what my mother has instilled in me. So I don't have a lot of my mother, which is why I wrote a book about her called This Is Your Mother. So I have something physical to hold. For me, home is my sister, my darling sister. And it's our traditions. We have a tradition where we see each other for our birthday. I go to her for hers. She comes to me for mine. And we have a birthday hat that I've had since I was 14. Like those traditions are home to me. And then I love the feeling of nostalgia. And so I love to collect pieces from my childhood, like DVDs, books, and toys that I lost to eviction to give myself that comfort back. But yeah, sometimes home is just like the relation that you have to your community. Even if you're not together, it's still surviving. Like Joseph said, if we can like just hop on a Zoom, or if we can learn together, if we can just connect, that is home, you know?
Mm, thanks, Erica. We're close to the top of the hour, so we'll jump, I think, to the last question. I usually like to conclude dialogues with a call to action of some kind for the audience. So, what is one action that readers should take, or at least one lesson that they should take away from your stories? Let's start with Nick and then continue with Erica, Joseph, and Aymann.
I would say the action taken away from my book would be something along the lines of um, what shapes are guiding the actions that you're taking every day? Not necessarily literal shapes, but like what are the sort of what are the tones, the sort of like how aware are you of the myths that you're following? You know, I think that, you know, to decolonize my imagination is a big part of this book. I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but to actually reclaim a sense of awareness over where I've actually been, like where the empire has like taken over my body. And I am trying, I think part of what I'm doing in this book is to actually attempt to find an alternative shape. And that's an action that like you can actually take every minute that you live. I mean, you can ask yourself, like, when I choose this, you know, to support this food system, you know, this local representative, are they actually following shapes of regenerative, like equity and inclusion? You know, are they actually following shapes that are ecological and that are seasonal and that are actually like for some sort of viable future? And so that's the action that I would say for my book.
For my book, I will say call your mother. That's the action. Just freaking call your mother. Don't give her grace for her mistakes, and then you will find that you give yourself grace for the ones that you make.
That one, and also I would just say learn more about Indigenous history and actually use it for something. You know, we don't learn about it just to like that happened in the past. That's interesting. You know, it's happening today, and I think especially with things happening politically, like it's really, really relevant what's happening to everybody, but with Indigenous communities, Indigenous land. Nick talked about the environmental issues, all of that stuff. So don't just learn it to learn it, learn it to do something.
And Aymann, take us home.
Yeah, I would say that the thing we should all do, honestly, is to keep track and write down everything. Document everything. You never know how valuable these things are going to be in the future. One of the things that you'll find in my book are old photographs of my family when they were young, before they had kids. And it's incredibly valuable to me. It's one of those things that's going to make them always feel immortal to me. And also to my children. One of the things that one practice that I had was imagining my kids when they got older, reading the book and revisiting these moments and imagining themselves as babies and experiencing like their own parents, trying to figure out how to raise them. It's something that I wish I did sooner with my own parents. Maybe I would have been nicer to them and more generous to them when they were so harsh on me. But it's also something that I think everybody should do. It's a practice that's going to, I think, change the way we record history. And that's all I say.
Well, thank you so much to all of our wonderful authors on this panel, and thank you to the librarians who joined us and are watching the recording virtually. Next up, we have a short break, so please make sure to visit the virtual exhibit hall to check out the free resources in the booths. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this day of dialogue. Thank you and take care.